Hello, everyone. Today we're diving into one of history's most notorious mysteries, Jack the Ripper. If you love true crime and historical deep dives, please share and subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss an upload. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. London, New York, Mumbai. I want to hear your thoughts and theories. Picture Whitechapel in autumn of 1888. A tangle of narrow cobbled alleys lit by flickering gas lamps that cast more shadow than light. Brick tenements, blackened by factory smoke, press so close together that rainwater trickles from rooftop to rooftop without ever touching the street. Laundry drips from iron hooks above doorways, and every doorstep is littered with refuse, crawling with rats the size of small cats. The air hangs heavy with coal dust, sewage, and the tang of rotting fish from the docks. Inside those cramped walls, families of 6 or 8 share a single room barely 10 feet square. Privacy is a cruel joke. The coughs, cries, and arguments of neighbors are audible through the thin plaster. When rent is overdue, fathers and mothers are dragged off to workhouses, grim institutions of forced labor and starvation rations. Disease follows in poverty's wake. Cholera, tuberculosis, typhus. Doctors are overwhelmed, and the sick rely on home remedies, cabbage poultices, opium drops, and the occasional pinch of laudanum to dull the pain. By nightfall, the streets clear of respectable folk. Shop shutters clang closed. The only life comes from the destitute, men too drunk to find their way home, peddlers hawking matches by lamplight, and the women known as streetwalkers, braving the danger to earn a few pence. Each of these women carries a story of hardship, lost children, abusive husbands, or the cruel bite of bad luck. They walk alone, hoping for a client who pays a shilling or two, then slipping back into the gloom before dawn. And it was in that fog-choked darkness that a predator emerged, one who moved without sound, without warning, and struck with chilling precision. He became known simply as Jack the Ripper. Jack was no ordinary criminal. His first known victim, Mary Ann Polly Nichols, was found in Buck's Row with her throat cut and her abdomen roughly sliced. The brutality was shocking, but the precision suggested more than blind rage. Then came Annie Chapman, whose mutilations indicated surgical skill, organs removed, flesh carved, a signature that spoke of anatomical knowledge. And yet, he left no footprints, no blood trail, no reliable witness. He vanished like a phantom. On the night of September 30th, in what newspapers dubbed the double event, Jack claimed 2 victims within hours. First, Elizabeth Stride, her throat cut, but no further mutilation, perhaps interrupted by a passerby. Then, Catherine Eddowes, found in Mitre Square, gutted and desecrated, her entrails displayed like a grotesque offering. The horror spread through Whitechapel like wildfire. Mothers clutched their children, lamplighters doubled their patrols, and even hardened policemen felt a tremor in their boots. 2 months later, his final known victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was butchered inside her own rented room at Miller's Court. Here, Jack's fury reached its crescendo. Her body was unrecognizable beneath the horrified screams of onlookers. He had brought his slaughter indoors, beneath the flicker of a single gaslight, ensuring no witness but the walls themselves. Between murders, letters arrived at Scotland Yard and local newspapers, taunting, boastful, mocking. "Dear boss," one began, describing the crimes in chilling detail and signing off, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Some dismissed them as hoaxes. Others feared the writer was the killer himself. playing a sinister game of cat and mouse. To this day, we debate his identity. A surgeon, a butcher, a drifter with a twisted fascination for anatomy. Over 100 suspects have been named: Montague Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, Francis Tumblety, yet none fit every clue. No fingerprints, no forensic evidence, no CCTV. Just 5 women, lost to history, but immortalized by terror, and a name that refuses to be forgotten. As the autumn wind howls through Whitechapel's empty streets, we're left with a single truth. Jack the Ripper walked among ordinary Londoners, hidden in plain sight, wielding a blade and a silence more deadly than steel. His victims' stories remind us that evil often wears a familiar face and strikes when we least expect it. Stick around, because next we'll unravel the details of the double event, examine the infamous letters that taunted the world, and explore the desperate hunt that tried and failed to catch the man behind the myth. Chapter 2, The Double Event, A Night of Terror in Whitechapel. It was the early hours of September 30th, 1888. The streets of Whitechapel were quiet, but beneath the silence, fear was growing. The air was thick with fog, curling around buildings and drifting through narrow alleyways. It had only been a few weeks since the last murder, and everyone knew the killer wasn't done yet. People walked faster, doors were locked tighter, but no one was prepared for what was coming that night. Just before 1 a.m., a man named Louis Diemschutz was returning to Dutfield's yard on Berner Street with his horse and cart. As he guided the cart into the gate, his horse suddenly shied away from something lying on the ground. It was a woman. At first, he thought she was drunk, but when he leaned closer and saw the blood pooling beneath her head, he realized the truth. Her throat had been cut clean through. She was dead. The woman was later identified as Elizabeth Stride, a 45-year-old prostitute known locally as Long Liz. But something about the scene was strange. Unlike the previous victims, there were no mutilations. Just one clean, deep slash across the throat. Police later believed the killer had been interrupted. Someone had scared him off before he could finish what he started. That interruption may have saved Elizabeth from an even more brutal end. Yet the killer wasn't finished. Just 45 minutes later, and less than a mile away, another woman would die. At around 1:45 a.m., a constable patrolling near Mitre Square discovered a second body. This one was far worse. The victim was Catherine Eddowes, a 46-year-old woman who had been released from police custody just shortly before. Her throat had been slashed so deeply it almost severed her head. Her abdomen had been ripped open, and her intestines were draped over her shoulder. Part of her uterus and one kidney were missing. It was the most brutal murder so far. The sheer speed between the two killings stunned the police. 2 victims in less than an hour. 2 murders in one night. This became known as the double event, and it sent London into a frenzy. The newspapers exploded with headlines. The public was in shock. No one felt safe. This night confirmed several terrifying things about Jack the Ripper. First, he was fearless. He had no problem moving from one murder to the next, even with the police nearby. Second, he was efficient. These weren't sloppy or rushed killings. They were fast, precise, and brutal. And third, he was escalating. The violence was getting worse, the mutilations more extreme. The city panicked. People refused to go out after dark. Women stopped working the streets. Angry mobs accused innocent men of being the Ripper. The police were overwhelmed. Every night, more officers were sent out on patrol. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every stranger felt dangerous. The fear wasn't just on the streets. It crept into homes, into families, into everyday life. No one could stop talking about Jack the Ripper. Everyone had a theory, a doctor gone mad, a butcher with a thirst for blood, a foreigner hiding in the shadows. But no matter how many suspects were questioned, no one could find him. The killer himself seemed to enjoy the chaos. Shortly after the double event, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency. It was written in red ink and signed with a chilling new name, Jack the Ripper. The writer mocked the police, claimed credit for the killings, and promised more to come. At first, the letter was dismissed as a hoax, but then came the detail that changed everything. The writer mentioned he had kept part of a kidney. Days later, another part of a kidney arrived in the mail, sent to the head of the local vigilance committee. Medical experts confirmed it was human. That was when the city knew. This wasn't just a madman. This was someone who enjoyed the attention. Someone who planned his killings with care. Someone who took trophies. The double event changed everything. It showed how quickly Jack could strike. It proved he wasn't afraid of the police. It revealed just how savage he could be. And worst of all, it reminded everyone that he could be anywhere, watching, waiting, ready to kill again. As October began, Whitechapel held its breath. No one knew when or where Jack would strike next. But everyone believed one thing for certain: he would strike again. Chapter 3. The Autumn of Terror begins. The streets of Whitechapel in 1888 were tight and crooked, choked with the smoke of coal fires, the noise of horse hooves on cobblestones, and the occasional scream that echoed into the night and vanished without a trace. In the foggy shadow of London's East End, where the gas lamps barely pierced the gloom, a name was about to be written in blood. A name the world still whispers today: Jack the Ripper. August faded into September. The air was growing colder, and so were the hearts of the people living in Whitechapel. Something evil was settling over their homes, something cruel, something patient. At 3:40 a.m. on August 31st, 1888, a carman named Charles Cross was walking to work down Buck's Road. It was dark, silent, cold. He noticed something lying on the pavement just inside the gate to a stable yard. At first, he thought it was a tarpaulin, maybe a bundle of cloth. But as he got closer, he realized it was the body of a woman. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, was 43 years old, a mother, a former wife, a woman who had slipped through society's cracks and landed in the desperate network of lodging houses and street corners that many women in Whitechapel came to know. Her throat had been cut twice with a single clean blade. Her abdomen had been slashed open, the wounds deep and savage. She was laid on her back, her skirt pulled up, as if to deliberately display the horror. But there was something even stranger. Despite the violence, there was no blood on the surrounding ground. The killer had been careful, precise, controlled. The police arrived. They noted the mutilations. They questioned witnesses, but they were already behind. This was not a crime of passion, not a drunken outburst. It was something much colder, clinical. The newspapers exploded. Another murder in Whitechapel. Horrible discovery. The public was fascinated and terrified. The East End already had a reputation for violence and poverty. But this This was different. This was the beginning. Just over a week later, on the night of September 8th, another body was found. This time, in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. The scene was even worse than before. Her name was Annie Chapman. She too was middle-aged, homeless, a woman who had once had a family, but was now surviving night to night. Annie was found at around 6 a.m. by a man out collecting soap for resale. Her throat had been cut deeply. Her abdomen was opened again, but this time organs were missing. Her uterus had been taken. It was surgical. One of the detectives on the scene remarked, "He must have had some knowledge of anatomy." The killer had worked quickly. It was estimated he had no more than 30 minutes before dawn and the risk of discovery, and yet he was careful enough to not wake anyone in the crowded tenement building just meters away. This was a man who planned, and more terrifying, he enjoyed it. With Annie Chapman's murder, the fear exploded into frenzy. The East End was in a panic. Women refused to go out at night. Men carried clubs. The police were under pressure from Parliament, from the newspapers, and from the terrified public. Letters started arriving. One, signed in a scrawled, dramatic hand, began, "Dear Boss." It spoke of future killings, of delight in the murders. It promised more blood, more women, and it was signed, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." That name stuck. Whether the letter was real or a cruel hoax, no one knew for sure. But it gave a face to the horror. Not a face you could sketch or arrest, but a shadowy figure with a name, Jack the Ripper. Now he had an identity, even if it was one born of fear and imagination. Then came the night of September 30th. It would be known as the double event. The first body was found at 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard, just off Burner Street. Elizabeth Stride was lying on her side. Her throat was cut, but strangely, there were no abdominal wounds. Some believed the Ripper had been interrupted, that someone had come too close, too soon. The killer fled before he could finish what he started. But Jack doesn't give up. Less than an hour later, just 45 minutes away on foot, a second body was found. Catherine Eddowes. Her throat was cut. Her face was slashed. Her abdomen had been opened. Again, organs removed. This time, her kidney was gone. The killer had vanished into the dark again. 2 women, 1 night. Jack was proving a point. He was mocking the police, mocking the fear, showing that he could strike whenever he pleased, and the letters kept coming. From hell, one read. A box accompanied it. Inside was a half of a human kidney, preserved in alcohol. "I fried and ate the other half," it said. "It was very nice." Was it real? No one could be certain, but the message was clear. Jack was not done. What terrified people wasn't just the murders, it was the randomness. These women were poor, desperate, but they had nothing in common beyond their circumstances. There was no clear motive, no obvious gain. Jack didn't steal. He didn't cover his tracks. He walked the same streets as everyone else. He was invisible. He could be anyone, and that made him more terrifying than any monster from fiction. Jack didn't just kill. He performed. He mutilated. He displayed his victims. It was as if he wanted the world to see his work and admire it. He didn't care about the victims. He wanted the fear. Whitechapel became a neighborhood of locked doors and shuttered windows, of whispers and prayers. Women stopped walking alone. But none of it mattered. Jack the Ripper wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was the shadow. By October, the police were desperate. Thousands of interviews, hundreds of people questioned. They even tried using bloodhounds. Nothing worked. The people started to lose faith in the police, in the government, even in justice. No one was safe. And Jack was still out there. And worst of all, the murders weren't random to him. They were ritual, measured, intentional. He had a goal, a message, and no one knew what it was. The press speculated. Was he a doctor, a butcher, an undertaker, a foreigner, a lunatic? Or was he someone no one would ever suspect? Someone who could smile and tip his hat, and then vanish into the London mist? Jack wasn't just a murderer. He was a ghost in the gaslight. And he wasn't finished. Chapter 4, Autumn of Terror, the double event. It was a cold and moonless night, September 30th, 1888. The East End of London lay beneath a blanket of silence, disturbed only by the scuffle of boots on cobblestone streets and the occasional distant shout. A fog drifted through Whitechapel, clinging to buildings and choking lantern light into dim halos. The people of Spitalfields had barely caught their breath after the last murder, but something far darker loomed. At approximately 1 a.m., a man named Louis Dimschutz, a Jewish immigrant and member of the International Working Men's Educational Club, turned his pony and cart down Berner Street. The pony suddenly veered to the left, resisting its driver. Alarmed, Dimschutz stepped down to investigate. That's when he saw it, something lying in the shadows near the club's gate. He reached down and touched the body of a woman, cold, still, lifeless. This was the murder of Elizabeth Stride, the first of what would come to be known as the double event. Stride's throat had been slit, a clean, precise cut. But strangely, her body bore none of the post-mortem mutilations that had characterized Mary Ann Nichols or Annie Chapman. Was the Ripper interrupted? Some believe so. Dimschutz's arrival may have startled the killer into fleeing, leaving his grim ritual unfinished. But Jack the Ripper was not yet finished that night. Roughly 45 minutes later, less than a mile away, another body was found, this time in Mitre Square. The victim was Catherine Eddowes. Unlike Stride, Eddowes had not been spared the Ripper's full fury. Her throat had been cut with such force that it nearly severed her head. Her face was horribly disfigured, her eyelids slashed, her nose partially removed. The killer had opened her abdomen and removed a kidney and part of the uterus with surgical precision. The speed and savagery of the attack were chilling. From the time she was last seen alive to the time her body was discovered, no more than 15 minutes had passed. In that brief window, the Ripper had enacted a grotesque display of control, rage, and anatomical knowledge, and then vanished without a trace. The city was paralyzed with fear. This dual killing, carried out in separate locations within the span of an hour, solidified Jack the Ripper's legend as a specter of horror. No one was safe. The killer's ability to navigate the East End so quickly, so efficiently, raised terrifying questions. Was he a local, a doctor, a butcher? The police were under immense pressure. The Metropolitan Police handled the Stride case. The City of London Police investigated Eddowes' murder. Coordination between the two forces was poor, driven by territorialism and a lack of modern forensic science. And yet, that night, the Ripper made a mistake. As officers scoured the surrounding area, they discovered a piece of Catherine Edauer's apron in a doorway on Goulston Street, near a tenement block. It was smeared with blood. Above it, scrawled in chalk on the wall, were the chilling words, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." This message sparked immediate tension in a city already simmering with anti-Semitism. The police commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, fearing riots and public backlash, ordered the graffiti erased before it could be photographed. It remains one of the most controversial decisions in the case's history. Had Jack the Ripper left a message, or had it simply been a coincidence? By now, London was in a state of panic. The newspapers had stoked the flames, feeding the public's morbid curiosity. Sketches of the crime scenes circulated widely. Anonymous letters claiming to be from the killer flooded police desks. Most were hoaxes, but two stood out. The first was the now infamous Dear Boss letter, which had given Jack his name. But it was the postcard received just after the double event, known as the Saucy Jackie postcard, that really struck a nerve. It read, "I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number one squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had not time to get ears for police." It was signed Jack the Ripper. For the first time, the killer acknowledged the murders in his own words, mocking the police, feeding off the fear he'd cultivated. And the public, for all their terror, were captivated. Jack the Ripper was more than a murderer now. He was a myth, a phantom, a symbol of chaos. The East End became a theater of suspicion. Ordinary men were accused, lynched, harassed. Butchers were eyed with distrust. Doctors were interrogated. The Jewish community, already marginalized, bore the brunt of public anger. The Ripper had not only taken lives, he had fractured the very fabric of a city. As the investigation stumbled, the press thrived. Journalists printed everything from eyewitness accounts to wild speculation. The image of Jack became that of a top-hatted gentleman, cloaked in fog, lurking just out of sight, a twisted gentleman of death. But behind this spectacle lay real tragedy. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were more than victims. They were people. Stride was a hard-working woman, a cleaner, known to sing at the club where she died. Eddowes was witty and clever, a storyteller with a sharp tongue. Their lives, often reduced to the final few moments, were rich and complex. Yet in death, they became chapters in a narrative controlled by someone else. With the double event, Jack the Ripper had escalated his terror. The killings weren't slowing. They were accelerating, and London held its breath, waiting for what would come next. But behind closed doors, police officers were beginning to panic. Leads were scarce. Tips led nowhere. Hundreds of people were interviewed. Hundreds more were watched. False confessions poured in. Mediums offered help. Theories abounded. Was it a Freemason plot? A deranged nobleman? A foreign sailor? No one could agree. And the city, still draped in fog, began to whisper the name Jack the Ripper like a curse. The terror wasn't just in the murders, it was in the silence that followed, the not knowing. The dread of a shadowy figure who could appear, mutilate, and disappear again before the body had gone cold. The killer had struck twice in one night. He had proven he could act with speed, precision, and complete impunity. And yet, the worst was still to come. Chapter 5. The Murder of Mary Jane Kelly. The morning of November 9th, 1888, dawned cold and gray in the East End of London. Rain had soaked the streets of Whitechapel overnight, and the sky hung heavy with the weight of oncoming winter. It was just another miserable Friday for most of London. But by noon, news would spread that Jack the Ripper had struck again. And this time, it was worse than anyone could have imagined. The victim was Mary Jane Kelly, a 25-year-old woman who lived at 13 Miller's Court, a tiny room just off Dorset Street. Unlike the other victims, Mary had not been murdered in the shadows of the street. She had been killed indoors, behind a closed door, in the supposed safety of her own home. Mary Jane Kelly was younger than the Ripper's other victims. She was also more mysterious. She often told stories of her past that didn't quite add up. Some said she was from Ireland. Others believed she had lived in Wales or even France. She claimed to have once lived in a high-class brothel in the West End and to have spoken fluent French. Whether truth or fantasy, her stories painted a picture of a life filled with hardship, longing, and reinvention. She was last seen alive in the early hours of November 9th, singing a song from her childhood, A Violet from Mother's Grave, while inside her room with a man who had reportedly brought her a drink. It was around 2 a.m. when a neighbor heard her voice. After that, silence. At 10:45 a.m., her landlord's assistant, Thomas Bowyer, was sent to collect overdue rent. He knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Suspecting something was wrong, Bowyer peered through the cracked window pane and drew back in horror. Mary's body was lying on the bed, utterly mutilated. Bowyer ran for help, and soon the police were on the scene. What they found inside that tiny room shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Mary Jane Kelly had been butchered in a way that defied belief. Her throat was slashed down to the spine. Her face was so badly mutilated that it was almost unrecognizable. Her abdomen had been ripped open and emptied. Her breasts had been cut off. Flesh from her thighs had been removed and placed on the bedside table. Her heart was missing. This was not a murder. This was an annihilation. Unlike the Ripper's previous killings, which had occurred under pressure of time and risk of discovery, this was done in seclusion. The killer had privacy, time. He had been free to act out his deepest, darkest impulses without fear of interruption. This is what Jack the Ripper was capable of when left alone with his victim. Investigators were stunned. Some wept at the sight. Even the hardened pathologist, Dr. Thomas Bond, wrote that it was the most horrific crime he had ever examined. Bond later suggested that the killer might suffer from an erotic mania, a primitive compulsion to destroy the sexual organs of women. The autopsy revealed something else: the precision, the cuts, the order of the dismemberment, the anatomical knowledge. This wasn't just rage, it was methodical, intentional. Every cut served a purpose in the killer's mind. This was the Ripper unleashed. Mary Jane Kelly's murder sent shockwaves across Britain. Newspapers printed graphic descriptions. Artists drew vivid, if dramatized, illustrations. The public, already terrified, now felt there was no escape. If a woman could be torn apart in her own home, what hope did anyone else have? The police were no closer to catching the killer. Leads went nowhere. Witnesses were unreliable. The area around Miller's Court was thick with poverty, secrecy, and fear. Nobody had seen anything, or, if they had, they weren't talking. Desperation began to show in the Metropolitan Police. Hundreds of officers were deployed, rewards were offered, undercover agents mingled with the destitute. But nothing came of it. As for the letters, they kept coming. Some were cruel hoaxes, others seemed to mimic the Ripper's style. But none offered anything new, and none led to his capture. Mary Jane Kelly was the final canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. After her, the killings stopped, or at least the ones attributed to him did. Why? That remains one of the great mysteries of the case. Did the killer die? Was he arrested for a different crime? Did he simply stop, satisfied with what he had done? Or did he go somewhere else, continuing his reign of terror under a different name? What made Mary's murder so chilling wasn't just the brutality. It was the intimacy. She likely knew her killer. She had let him in. He had looked her in the eye, perhaps even spoken to her gently, before unleashing horror. The crime was monstrous, but it was committed in the most human of spaces, a bed, a room, a home. In the aftermath, Miller's Court became infamous. People avoided the narrow alley where it had happened. Dorset Street, once just another poor lane in Spitalfields, was now called the worst street in London. Mary Jane Kelly was buried on November 19, 1888. Her funeral was attended by thousands. Though she had lived a life of hardship and anonymity, in death she became a symbol. The city mourned, not just for her, but for all the women who had been forgotten, brutalized, and discarded. The Ripper had shown the world a mirror, reflecting the darkness not just of one man, but of a society that had allowed such horror to grow in its shadows. And now, the killings were over. But the nightmare had only just begun. Chapter 6. The Media Frenzy and Public Panic. The autumn of 1888 saw not only blood on the cobblestones of Whitechapel, but also ink on every newspaper in London. The media became the fuel to the inferno. With each gruesome murder, reporters from every major publication descended upon the East End, hungry for stories that would grip their readers in the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the slums of Southwark alike. The tale of the Ripper was perfect fodder: mystery, horror, and the eerie anonymity of a killer who vanished into fog and shadow. The press dubbed him Jack the Ripper after a letter was sent to the Central News Agency claiming to be from the killer himself. It was signed, chillingly, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Whether it was truly from the killer or an opportunistic hoax is still debated, but the name stuck like dried blood. Newspapers couldn't print fast enough. Headlines screamed, "Another horrible murder," and "The Whitechapel Fiend Strikes Again." As the broadsheet sold out across the city, the public's thirst for more only grew. The coverage was often lurid, exaggerated, and sensationalist. Papers described the mutilations in gory detail, painting pictures with words that made people shiver over their morning tea. Fear gripped the East End. Women feared to walk alone at night. Men looked suspiciously at their neighbors. People whispered theories in pubs and on factory floors. The working-class poor, already marginalized, became both victims and suspects. Jewish immigrants in particular were unfairly blamed, leading to dangerous waves of xenophobia and violence. Innocent men were chased, beaten, and even jailed based on nothing more than their beards or accents. Scotland Yard, under Commissioner Charles Warren, struggled to manage the media frenzy. Every move the police made was scrutinized and criticized. When officers washed blood from a message scrawled in chalk near one of the crime scenes, a message that may have provided a vital clue, the press lambasted them for destroying evidence. Penny dreadfuls and illustrated papers added fuel to the fire. They printed lurid illustrations of cloaked men stalking foggy alleys, bloody knives in hand. Artists imagined the killer as a maniac, a doctor, a devil. The Ripper transformed from man into myth. He became the bogeyman of an industrial age, his faceless cruelty embodying every fear that modern life brought with it. Women began protesting in the streets. They demanded more protection, better lighting, and accountability from the authorities. The Ripper murders sparked a primitive form of feminist outrage. As women pointed out the squalid conditions of the East End and the way society treated the lives of poor prostitutes as expendable. Meanwhile, journalists invented increasingly bizarre theories. Some claimed Jack was an American. Others believed he was a butcher, a barber, a sailor, or even a priest. The idea of a doctor gained popularity due to the apparent surgical precision of the mutilations. Conspiracy theories flourished, from Freemasons to royal cover-ups. It was as though everyone needed a narrative to explain what seemed otherwise incomprehensible. And amidst this chaos, the killer free. Perhaps he read the papers, chuckling at the chaos he'd caused. Perhaps he relished the idea that he had become a phantom, an icon, a name that sparked nightmares. By late October, the streets of Whitechapel were swarming with plainclothes detectives and private citizens playing amateur sleuths. But the fog remained thick. The Ripper remained a ghost. The media had made him eternal, a name in bold type, a shadow in the minds of every Londoner. He was no longer just a murderer. He was Jack the Ripper, a legend. And the panic he inspired would linger long after the blood had dried. This was not the end, but a transition. The killing slowed, the hysteria began to simmer down, but the mystery only deepened. In the next chapter, we unravel the growing list of suspects, a gallery of men who might have been Jack, and the strange, dark reasons why. Chapter 7. The Suspects. Faces behind the fog. Even as the murders ended, the obsession had only just begun. Jack the Ripper vanished into the mist of history, but the question haunted the world. Who was he? Scotland Yard, desperate for answers, investigated hundreds of men. Doctors, butchers, foreigners, madmen. The East End became a theater of paranoia, and every shadow looked like Jack's. Every man with bloodied hands, every stranger on a dark corner, he could be the one. Some names rose above the rest. Some were real suspects. Some were scapegoats. But each carries a sliver of darkness that still fascinates. The first serious name to surface was Montague John Druitt. He was a barrister and part-time schoolmaster, educated, intelligent, and from a respectable family. But he had secrets. Druitt suffered mental health issues and may have been dismissed from his teaching job under unclear circumstances. In December 1888, weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's murder, his body was found in the Thames. A suicide. In his pockets, stones. The coroner ruled he had been dead for weeks. Around the same time, the Ripper killing stopped. Coincidence? Or had the killer taken his own life? Police officials seemed to think it meant something. Assistant Chief Constable Melville McNatton wrote later that Druitt was sexually insane, and that he was strongly suspected of being the Ripper. But McNagnon was writing years after the fact, and his account had inconsistencies. There's no proof Druitt had medical knowledge, no link to Whitechapel, just a hunch, and a body in the river. Then there was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew, mentally ill and known to roam Whitechapel's alleys. He suffered from auditory hallucinations, refused to eat food others prepared, and eventually ended up in an asylum. Kosminski lived in the heart of the killing zone, and according to police memos, a witness positively identified him, but refused to testify in court. That piece of evidence remains mysterious. Modern forensic enthusiasts later claimed DNA on Catherine Eddowes' shawl pointed to Kosminski, but that evidence is hotly debated. Was the shawl really at the crime scene? Was the DNA tested properly? Scientists warn that cross-contamination and degradation make any conclusions unreliable. Still, for many ripperologists, Kosminski remains the prime suspect. Another man who drew attention was Francis Tumblety, a flamboyant American quack doctor. He posed as a physician, but lacked real credentials. He was also known to collect body parts, specifically uteruses, which drew the attention of the British authorities after the Ripper murders. Tumblety had a deep hatred for women, especially prostitutes. He was in London during the killings, arrested on unrelated charges, and fled back to America when released on bail. Scotland Yard followed his trail, but never extradited him. Was he the killer, or just another eccentric caught in the whirlwind? Then there was Dr. Thomas Neal Cream, a convicted murderer known for poisoning women. He operated in both Canada and the United States, killing prostitutes with medicine laced with strychnine. When he was finally hanged in 1892, his last words, according to legend, were, "I am Jack the noose cut him off." But the timeline doesn't fit. Cream was in prison during the Ripper murders. Unless he had bribed officials or switched identities, he couldn't have been responsible. Some believe he had an accomplice. Others say the executioner embellished the quote. Still, Cream's name lingers in the dark list. And then there's the theory that never dies. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, a grandson of Queen Victoria, royal blood, tied by rumor and whispers to the murders. Some claimed he had a syphilitic brain. Others said he had fathered a child with a prostitute, and the royal family covered it up with deadly efficiency. This theory spiraled into a vast conspiracy involving the royal household, Freemasons, and the police. Popularized in books and films, it created a dramatic narrative. The Ripper was a cover-up, not a lone madman. But historians reject this. There is no evidence Albert was in London during all the murders. He had alibis, letters, and travel logs. The royal conspiracy, it seems, is more fiction than fact. But the fascination remains. Dozens of other names have emerged over time. George Chapman, who poisoned his wives. Walter Sickert, the painter whose work some say reflects a killer's mind. James Maybrick, whose alleged diary confessed to the crimes, though many call it a hoax. Carl Feigenbaum, a sailor with a taste for knives and a trail of violence. Each suspect is a puzzle piece, but no one fits perfectly. In truth, we may never know who Jack the Ripper was. The East End in 1888 was a world of shadows. People moved without records, names changed, lives vanished in workhouses and dark alleys. A man could commit atrocities and disappear into the fog, unseen, unknown, unremembered. But maybe Jack didn't want to be caught. Maybe he wanted the legend, the letters, the games, the fear. They were all part of the performance. He wasn't just a killer. He was an artist of horror. And we, the audience, have kept his work alive. Every suspect tells us more about what we fear. The madman, the foreigner, the doctor, the prince. But maybe the most terrifying possibility is this. Jack the Ripper was no one special. Just a man, a face in the crowd, a shadow on the street, a monster hiding in plain sight. And that's what makes him eternal. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. Myths, madness, and the legacy of a killer. The autumn of terror had ended, but its shadow stretched long over the years to come. The streets of Whitechapel were quieter now, but not because they were any safer. Rather, the terror had sunk in deep, into the hearts of the people, into the minds of the police, and into the pages of history. Jack the Ripper had vanished, leaving behind a trail of blood and unanswered questions. London would never be the same again. In the days that followed the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the final known victim, the police intensified their efforts. Hundreds of detectives were pulled into the case. Every lead was chased, every corner of Whitechapel scoured. But it was like chasing a ghost. The Ripper had not just killed women, he had murdered the city's sense of security, its trust in law enforcement, and its illusion of civility. And with each day that passed without an arrest, that wound grew deeper. Scotland Yard was under immense pressure. Commissioner Charles Warren had already resigned in disgrace just before Mary Kelly's murder. The Metropolitan Police, criticized for their inability to protect the poor, now found themselves the target of public outrage. Letters continued to flood in. Some were from self-proclaimed experts. Others were from lunatics confessing to the crimes. A few were from journalists playing at fiction. And then there were the letters that were signed with chilling familiarity. Jack the Ripper. None of them led anywhere. There were suspects, of course. Hundreds, thousands even. Some stood out more than others. Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher, drowned in the Thames shortly after the last murder. Some detectives believed his death coincided too perfectly with the end of the killings. But his connection was circumstantial at best. Then there was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant with a history of mental illness. He was placed in an asylum not long after the murders ended. Decades later, detectives would point to him as their likely culprit, citing secret memos and whispered confessions. But again, no concrete proof. Over the years, the list of suspects grew longer and stranger. Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria, Walter Sickert, a famous painter, even Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, was accused by conspiracy theorists. The mystery of Jack the Ripper had become a canvas onto which people painted their fears, suspicions, and darkest fascinations. And while theories abounded, Whitechapel tried to move on. But it was not so simple. The murders had exposed the deep divide between the classes in Victorian England. The rich read about the killings in their morning papers, sipping tea and expressing polite horror. But the poor lived it. They walked those same dark alleys, stood in those same long lines for a bed at the Doss House, sold their bodies out of the same desperation. And they knew that the system had failed them. The press had played a powerful role during the Ripper's reign. Newspapers printed gruesome illustrations and sensationalized accounts. Headlines screamed about fiends and butchers. Reporters prowled the streets, sometimes arriving at murder scenes before the police. The Ripper story sold papers, and the papers, in turn, fed the Ripper myth. Even the term Jack the Ripper had come from the media, a name signed on a letter sent to a London news agency, soaked in red ink and full of taunts. Whether the letter was real or a hoax, it didn't matter. The name stuck, and it gave the killer something more than a face. It gave him a legend. In the years that followed, the mythology only deepened. Books were written, plays were performed, stories were whispered in pubs and alleyways. Jack the Ripper had become something more than a murderer. He had become folklore, a monster of the modern age, not a demon from the past, but a creation of the present, a symbol of all that was wrong with society: poverty, inequality, violence, neglect. And through it all, no one ever saw his face. The Ripper hauntings didn't end in London. Around the world, cities had their own Rippers, copycats or unrelated murderers whose brutality drew comparisons. The Dusseldorf Ripper, the Black Dahlia Ripper. In each case, the name evoked a chilling echo. The real Jack may have killed 5 women, but his legacy inspired countless horrors. Scotland Yard never officially closed the case. It simply faded from priority, as all unsolved mysteries do. A few decades later, detectives would quietly admit defeat. They believed they had known who the killer was. But without physical evidence, confession, or witness, their hands were tied. The Ripper walked free, or perhaps died unnoticed, buried under an alias, taking his secrets with him. The murders of 1888 became a sort of dark genesis for modern criminal profiling. Investigators had begun to think beyond the bloodstains. What kind of person could commit such crimes? What mental state? What background? The Ripper case sparked the early seeds of forensic psychology. The idea that crimes could be understood, not just seen. And that changed everything. In time, Jack the Ripper was no longer just a figure of horror, but a subject of academic inquiry. Criminologists studied his patterns, historians examined his impact, authors dissected his letters and mapped out his movements. Tour guides led curious visitors through the murder sites. Museums displayed his legacy. Films, novels, podcasts, the story continued to be told, reshaped, remixed. And yet, for all the attention, the truth remained maddeningly out of reach. Every new theory offered a glimpse into possibility. A fresh suspect, a re-examined clue, a piece of DNA, always just on the edge of revelation. But no theory has ever been conclusive. The Ripper remains a ghost in history, his face blurred by time, his name soaked in blood. But perhaps the most disturbing part of it all is not that he escaped justice, but that he created something larger than himself, a phenomenon, a fascination. He became a mirror held up to the darkest parts of humanity, a reminder of what happens when society looks away, when the poor are ignored, when women are treated as disposable, when evil is allowed to slip through the cracks. Jack the Ripper did not just kill 5 women, he exposed a system that let him do it, a city that whispered when it should have screamed, a world that in some ways still hasn't learned. Today, Whitechapel is a different place, modern, developed, connected. but walk its narrow streets at night, and the echoes are still there, faint but present. The past lingers in the cobblestones, in the fog that rolls off the Thames, in the flicker of a street lamp. The story of Jack the Ripper didn't end with Mary Kelly. It never truly ended. It became legend, and legends never die. Chapter 9. The Legacy of Shadows. In the chilling silence of a fog-shrouded London alley, the story of Jack the Ripper did not end. It simply vanished into myth, into history, into the twisted folds of human fascination. But what remained was far more enduring than flesh and blood. It was something far colder: fear, intrigue, obsession. Over a century has passed since the last Ripper victim bled out on the cobbled stones of Whitechapel, and yet we still speak his name, Jack the Ripper, a name carved not into stone, but into the psyche of generations, a phantom that refuses to be forgotten. The Ripper's tale didn't fade quietly. It metastasized. It spread into newspapers, books, and films. Historians became detectives. Detectives became writers. Theories exploded like wildfire. Was he a doctor, a butcher, a member of the royal family, a foreigner? Or was he just a ghost story we created because we feared what might be lurking in ourselves? And then came the Ripperologists. Decade after decade, men and women obsessed over handwriting, ancestry, medical records, and DNA remnants from faded envelopes. Conferences were held. Museums were curated. Entire careers built on chasing a man who was never caught and may never have existed in the way we imagined. Whitechapel itself changed. The brothels and doss houses gave way to cafes, markets, and boutique shops. But the shadow never lifted. Walking tours still take visitors down those grim paths. Guides still whisper of Polly Nichols and Mary Jane Kelly, pointing to bricks still stained with the legend. For the police, Jack the Ripper became both a lesson and a curse. The case exposed how ill-equipped they were in an age before fingerprints, DNA, or criminal profiling. It haunted Scotland Yard, an open wound, a failure no one could quite bandage. But deeper still, the story of Jack the Ripper asks something uncomfortable of us. Why are we so fascinated by him? Why do we remember his name, but not those of his victims without effort? Is it the horror, the mystery, or something far more disturbing? That we see part of ourselves in the mask? He killed 5, maybe more, but he gave birth to thousands of imitators. Every serial killer since has been dubbed the modern-day Ripper. Why? Because he was the first, the original, the template for modern evil, cold, methodical, invisible. And that invisibility, that's what terrified us most. Because Jack the Ripper was never caught, we never got closure. No trial, no confession, no last words, just silence. That silence echoed through London, through time, through the darker parts of our minds. Some say Jack the Ripper was a failure of law enforcement. Others, a tragedy of society's neglect of the vulnerable. But perhaps he was both. A man shaped by a brutal world and a world unwilling to look too closely at its own rot. And in that reflection, we find the true horror. That Jack the Ripper may not have been a monster born from hell, but a man like any other. A man who walked among the crowds, who smiled at strangers, who disappeared into the fog without a trace and without a conscience. As we end this journey, remember this: Jack the Ripper is gone. But the questions he left behind about justice, about evil, about who we are when no one is watching, still linger in the dark corners of our cities, and perhaps our hearts. Thank you for walking these haunted streets with me. If this story gripped you, if it made you look over your shoulder even once, then share it. Subscribe for more stories that unravel the shadows. And tell me, where are you listening from? Because the night is long, the fog is thick, and not all ghosts are dead.